Well, hello to everyone watching the S.E.E.D online conference. This is Mark Devlin out of the UK. I had hoped to be out there in person in Ohio in May of 2020. I think we all know what came along to scupper those plans. There was then some hope I might be able to make it in person for May 2021, but unfortunately we're not in a position where that is practical either. Because for as long as quarantine, test and trace, masks, distancing, vax passports and the rest of such BS is in place, I won't be travelling internationally again. And this is a pretty horrifying prospect for me because I'm someone that's always enjoyed travel. I find it very therapeutic, it's good for the soul, it's one of my favourite pastimes. I love going to different places, meeting different people. And the idea of never being able to do that again and having to spend the rest of my days in this God-forsaken hellhole fills me with dread. But who knows where we'll be this time next year? Who knows how this situation might resolve itself? We live in hope for it. In the meantime, I've got my presentation for you remotely right now. I want to thank Brandon and everyone else involved in organising S.E.E.D for the opportunity. Big shout out to all the other speakers, and of course much respect to everyone tuned in listening. I hope you will find my presentation to be fulfilling, and I hope to see you in person sooner rather than later. The title of this presentation is Music's Military and Mind Control Connections, and this draws on the full 11 years worth of research that I've done into the true nature of the corporate controlled music business and those forces that direct it. This was the basis of my first book, Musical Truth Volume 1, which came out in 2016. The second volume appeared in 2018, and I'm currently writing Musical Truth Volume 3, which is due out at the end of this year. When I first embarked on this road of research, I made the mistake of thinking that all the phenomena that I was uncovering, such as mind control artists, occult symbology in the music industry, social engineering agendas being pushed, was a relatively recent The title of this presentation is Music's Military and Mind Control Connections, and it draws on the full 11 years worth of research that I've done into this subject area. This formed the basis of my first two Musical Truth books, which I put out in 2016 and 2018 respectively, and I'm currently writing Volume 3, which I'm looking to get out at the end of the year, because the story is very far from finished being told. When I first embarked on this area of research and made it my specialist subject, I made the mistake of thinking that phenomena such as mind-controlled artists, dark occult symbology, social engineering agendas being pushed through popular culture were relatively recent things. And as I delved further into it, I found that it went further and further back in time. So far from being something that's restricted to just the 2000s. I found myself going back in time through the 1990s, being transported back into the 1980s, back through the 70s to the 60s, and all the way back to the very birth of the popular music industry. And I pinpoint that as being around 1955, if I had to put a time on it, in terms of when this aspect of popular culture really became weaponized for changing societal attitudes, particularly among young people. And this was the time of Bill Haley and the Comets' Rock Around the Clock, which was a pretty revolutionary record. It was quite groundbreaking for the time, because up to that point, America and Britain and most other countries were living in quite grim, grey, austere post-war conditions. It was still the first decade after the end of the Second World War, and music that had gone before had been very solemn or very placid, kind of sheet music based artists. Very respectable, very family friendly, nothing particularly edgy or dangerous about them. There was an explosion in 1955 of popular culture One aspect of it came through the movie Rock Around the Clock and the soundtrack to it put together by Bill Haley and the Comets. It was the rock and roll sound. It was ostensibly taking black forms of music. It was rhythm and blues going back into earlier forms of black music that had been brought onto the slave plantations of America, going way back in that era. And one form of music had evolved into another, and by the time you got to the 1950s, black rhythm and blues music had morphed into what was starting to be known as rock and roll. And one of the respectable faces of that whole movement was this group, Bill Haley and the Comets. Bill Haley was a pretty unlikely frontman for this group and exponent of this kind of sound. He was well into his 30s by this point, by no means young by the industry's standards, and he'd experimented with all kinds of other styles, including country and bluegrass music, before he settled on rock and roll, or was chosen for the role, possibly. It had been decided at this point by those that control culture that the youth of the time was going to be given a real kick up the arse. Everything was going to get shaken up, and the face of what cultural vehicles looked like was going to be very different to what had gone before. So there were three very important groundbreaking movies from a social engineering perspective in 1955. As well as the movie version of Rock Around the Clock, you also had The Blackboard Jungle and James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. And this all coincided with the arrival of the concept in America of the teenager, a young adult rife for manipulation by social scientists and psychologists and those that wish to control societal perceptions and attitudes by way of popular culture. It's a great way of getting it done. Entertainment, when people's guard is down and nobody is expecting to have their life view shaped subconsciously for them by other forces, when all they think they're doing is going to the cinema, enjoying a great movie, or listening to a great piece of music. Going back to the very early roots of the American record industry, and those of other countries, we find that many of the prominent recording labels through which these important early artists came out have direct links back into the military, the world of the military, and the world of military intelligence. One great example is RCA, which stands for Radio Corporation of America. This came out of the US Navy, and it spearheaded many of the standards in vinyl record production, and of course spawned the RCA record label through which many prominent music artists were promoted. And this is very far from an isolated instance. You find this with all the major early record labels. EMI, which stood for Electrical Mechanical Industries, that became the Beatles label through Parlophone in the UK. We find it also has links into British military intelligence. It goes back to Sir Joseph Lockwood out of the aristocracy, who spearheaded this whole operation. And we can see here that it's got links to the British War Office and all kinds of aspects of military intelligence. And you often found with many of these early record labels, they were involved in researching new breakthroughs in sound production. In many instances, these were initially for military applications, so they would be developing sonar systems, radar systems, radio control systems, and many of these technologies were later applied to the recording industry, and that which had been learnt from military intelligence research was applied on a record label corporate level. Decca Records is another one, no exception to the rule. We often found in those early days that the recording industry, as it started to consolidate, it began to organise itself very efficiently in getting all its assets together in one place. So when it comes to the country music industry, very key when it comes to societal influence, particularly over a certain demographic in the United States, The country music industry, according to many researchers, including Fritz Springmeier, with many comments he's made to me, is an absolute hotbed of mind-controlled artists. This is where we get into trauma-based mind control as a favourite tactic that the establishment uses to make sure its assets, its key players, whether that be politicians, whether it be Hollywood actors, television presenters, professional sports people, or musicians, to make sure they all stay on track and do what's expected of them without breaking ranks and becoming a thorn in the side of the establishment. Mind control is everywhere. The country music industry stands as a great example. Dolly Parton as a great example of an artist that would have been subjected to that. But this is country music's mecca. It's Music Row in Nashville, and this is an area of the city where all the big music publishers, the record labels, the music clubs, all the performance venues were grouped together into just a few small blocks so that everything is in walking distance of everything else, and therefore everything can be very closely controlled. It just seems to be one of the ways in which the industry likes to control things. This, going back to an earlier era, is Tin Pan Alley, so called, in New York City. And this was the place where all the early songwriters of that time were based. Going back to the 1920s and the 30s and going forward, the publishers of sheet music and all the popular songwriters of the day were based in this one small area of Manhattan, just a few streets, known as Tin Pan Alley. One of the, or possibly the biggest superstar to emerge out of that very early 1950s era was, of course, Elvis Presley. When we think about mind-controlled artists, Elvis becomes a prime candidate for this role. There is much speculation, and there's been some evidence to suggest that Elvis was very much in the pocket of the military intelligence community, and that in fact, when he was going out on many of his international tours, he was undertaking certain espionage work on behalf of his paymasters, whether that be the CIA or the FBI or certain other alphabet agencies. He seems to have had connections to police departments and the Food and Drug Administration even in various cities as well, which casts some very dubious light on his background. He also put in a couple of years of military service himself when he was called up by the draft, and his handler, well, ostensibly his manager, was the guy that you see sitting to his side here, who went by the name of Colonel Tom Parker. He was a Dutch guy with a complicated Dutch name and an even more complicated past. Nobody really knows where he came from. He seems to have entered the US as an illegal immigrant, but he became embroiled in the world of military intelligence, and he earned the nickname Colonel for himself. And the next thing you know, Colonel Tom Parker has popped up as Elvis Presley's manager, but many researchers believe that he was in fact his mind control handler that was overseeing his activities and keeping an eye on things. And I hear that the movie that Tom Hanks was recently filming in Australia is all about Elvis Presley, with Hanks playing the role of Colonel Tom Parker. And I don't know about you, but I've heard a thing or two about Tom Hanks in recent weeks and months. So it remains to be seen just how much truth there is to what may have happened to Tom Hanks and what he's been involved with. But that's by the by. Here's Elvis Presley with Jimmy Savile. Not too sure how up people in the US are on the activities of Jimmy Savile. Just to recap, he was a British television presenter and radio DJ, and he worked for the BBC, those nice people, for several decades. He presented a show called Top of the Pops, the very first episode of it in 1964. He also had a show called Jim'll Fix It, and there seems to be more to that title than first meets the eye. He was a real mover and shaker in the early music business in the UK, and he came to associate with all the prominent artists of that era going forward. So it's no great surprise to see him hanging out here with Elvis Presley, because he did seem to be in the company of pretty much every major artist of the time. There could be some sort of mind control situation going on here. Possibly Savile is fulfilling the role of a handler. Here he is with Cliff Richard, who, when he first emerged in 1958, was actually being positioned as a kind of British Elvis. He was making edgy rock and roll music before he went more into the Christian scene in the mid-1960s. But Savile seems to have had a relationship with Cliff Richard, and Cliff Richard in turn had some very dubious relationships when we come into aspects of the British establishment. Here he is with Lord Bob Boothby, a prominent Labour politician from the 1960s, a homosexual and, according to many accounts, an absolutely raging paedophile. And there are links between Cliff Richard going into the Kray twins, the notorious East End gangsters, who themselves are also said to have been the subject of mind control experimentation, being twins, and to have been procuring children for sexual abuse at the hands of the rich and famous. It becomes a very tangled web when you look into these very early days in the British industry, but certain names keep cropping up. Cliff Richards does, Jimmy Savile's does, the Kray twins do, as do many others. Brian Epstein, manager of the Beatles, a guy named Joe Meek, who was a record producer who blasted the landlady of the lodging house that he was staying in to death before turning the gun on himself when it appeared that he was about to get implicated in investigations into a paedophile ring operating out of London, and in particular the murder of a rent boy named Bernard Oliver, whose body was discovered chopped up and placed in several suitcases. When it looked like that was about to become public knowledge, Joe Meek, very prominent musician, he was part of the Tornadoes group, which had an early hit with Telstar, and a record producer in his own right, removed himself from the picture. Things start to get very ugly here, as we can see. Very far from the glitz and the glamour that most people perceive the music industry to be all about. Here we've got the Beatles with Jimmy Savile, who for a short time in the 60s used to travel around with them to some of their shows and introduce them. And there are some very dubious pictures of Savile with the Beatles. Many of them do hint at some kind of mind control situation going on. More to the Beatles themselves than meets the eye as well. Here we've got the two prominent members, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. This is before we get into the popular theory that the individual we have today may not in fact be the original Paul McCartney. That's a whole different can of worms, is a whole different rabbit hole to fall down, and I'll do that justice on another presentation. So were the Beatles Freemasons? Well, this handshake would certainly seem to suggest so, and it's not as if we've had any lack of visual clues to suggest that the Beatles were very strongly steeped in the world of the dark occult and esoteric mysteries, and that they knew what they were doing, or at least those that controlled them did. Just before we move on to the so-called fifth Beatle, we have an interesting scenario here with two future Beatles wives. So this is Yoko Ono, who became the second wife of John Lennon, and Linda Eastman, born Epstein. So the original family name was Epstein. Her father was Leopold Epstein. I think he was a Lithuanian Jew. And he came over to the United States and wanted to make himself sound less Jewish and more all-American. So he changed his name to Lee Eastman, and Eastman became the family name. So this is Linda. Now the interesting thing about these two is that Linda Eastman was raised in a town by the name of Scarsdale in Westchester County, New York State, upstate New York. She attended high school there and spent her formative years in that town. It turns out that earlier than that, Yoko Ono's father who was a prominent banker. He came from a long-standing banking dynasty in Japan, and Yoko's mother was descended from the Emperor of Japan, so she was Japanese royalty, aristocracy. Well, Yoko's banker father split his business time between Japan and New York, and when he was over in New York, the family stayed in the town of Scarsdale, Westchester County, New York. So you have two women who would go on to marry members of the most popular and influential pop group ever, both happening to grow up in Scarsdale, New York, which raises the question, what is it about this town that attracted both of these families to it? Or is it down to straight coincidence? Because if it is coincidence, it's at odds of several million to one that both of these would find themselves in the same town. There's more to Scarsdale, it turns out. There's a long list of celebrities, famous people who have connections to it, who have grown up there, including Judy Garland, just looking down the list here, Lisa Donovan, Elle Jolson, Rob Reiner, Susan Lucci, many, many others. So there really is something about Scarsdale that it's worth knowing. So on to the so-called fifth Beatle, who is Sir George Martin. There's lots of Sirs in this story when you get into the British side of the music industry. Sir Paul McCartney with Sir George Martin. He was the producer of the Beatles, coming out of the EMI record label, working out of EMI's famous Abbey Road studios. And he's responsible very much for the distinctive recorded Beatles sound, particularly in their second phase. Round about 1966, the Beatles' music changed big time. Up to that point, they had ostensibly been a boy band. When they first emerged, they were very squeaky clean in image, they were very family friendly, and they were singing pleasant love songs about I Want to Hold Your Hand and Love Me Do. By the time 1966 came around and they were experimenting with songs like Tomorrow Never Knows, based around Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we'd started to get into the LSD-drenched psychedelic counterculture era, which really blew up in 1967. But the Beatles were very much ahead of the curve, and they were starting to prepare British and American audiences for these big social changes that they knew were to come in the latter half of the 1960s. Much of that would be down to the hand of George Martin. I suspect that the Beatles were a project of social engineering, with connections to the Tavistock Institute of Human Engineering, which specialises in shaping and moulding societal attitudes by tried and tested methods. It employs anthropologists, psychologists, social scientists, full-time experts who are very adept at how to manipulate the human psyche, and they use popular culture to achieve this. So they have their hand in the film industry, they have their hand in television, in mass media, and of course in the music industry. And when it comes to the art of sonic manipulation and hidden messages that can be placed in musical recordings, they would need somebody very skilled, very knowledgeable, very down with the program, and very trustworthy at the helm of a group that was going to turn out to be as influential as the Beatles. And this was the role fulfilled by Sir George Martin, part of the aristocracy, coming out of one of these important bloodline families and given an important role in shaping and moulding culture. He worked for a time at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop before becoming a producer for EMI. And the Radiophonic Workshop specialises in sound and studies what can be achieved through sonic manipulation. It looks at things like sound frequencies and what can be hidden in an audio recording that isn't accessible by the conscious mind, but is only absorbed by the subconscious mind. So George Martin was somebody that came to the picture with a great deal of knowledge in these areas. And it's for no pale reason that he was referred to as the fifth Beatle, being as influential as he was. Now, talking about the 1960s counterculture psychedelic era, we get into the work of the late great author and researcher David McGowan, who sadly passed away on the 22nd of November, the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, interesting date for a conspiracy researcher, in 2015, of a very fast-acting and aggressive form of cancer. Dave left behind in the world some very important work, specifically this book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. In this book, Dave delved into the backgrounds of so many of the prominent musicians that populated that counterculture, folk rock, country rock, hippie scene that came along in the latter half of the 1960s. It changed societal attitudes, it changed culture forever. We're still feeling the ripples from that 1960s era even now, and that was always the plan. But nobody before had really gone delving into the family backgrounds of so many of these musicians. And nobody before had really focused on this one small neighborhood in Los Angeles, up in the Hollywood Hills, known as Laurel Canyon. The hippie counterculture scene is generally acknowledged to have come out of San Francisco, and largely the Haight-Ashbury district up there. But many of the familiar names that helped shape and mould that whole scene and change the face of music in the latter half of the 60s came out of Laurel Canyon. And this was a very odd thing, because there had been no musical history within Laurel Canyon prior to 1965. There were no recording studios there, no music clubs, no musicians were known for being based there. It did, however, house a covert military research facility known as Lookout Mountain, which, among its various activities, had been involved in producing propaganda films on behalf of the US military and the US Navy, many thousands of them reportedly. And among those who are said to have had top secret clearance to go and work there were Marilyn Monroe, James Stewart, and Bob Hope, among many others. So elsewhere in the district of Laurel Canyon, from about 1965 onwards, you had a whole host of musicians that came flocking from miles around, all over the United States, from Canada, from the United Kingdom, and they all very quickly started basing themselves in this very small neighbourhood in the Hollywood Hills. What is it about Laurel Canyon? Could it be connected to that military base, to its history? So McGowan went digging into the family backgrounds of these musicians and thought it'd be interesting to find out what the fathers did and what other affiliations there were. And what he found was that almost without one solitary exception, these musicians, who supposedly were grassroots, organic, these bands had just come up out of nowhere, they'd just started writing songs, picked up a guitar, played a few gigs, managed to get a record deal against all the odds, just down to good luck and pure chance. The fathers involved had direct connections back into the world of the military, of military intelligence, or connections into aspects of government, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. Now, this seems to be an unlikely thing. You wouldn't expect to find this with the fathers of musicians, or if you found it with one or two, you wouldn't expect to find it with all of them. And the classic example that McGowan gave was that of Jim Morrison of The Doors, who was very much positioned as a poster child for the counterculture, anti-establishment, anti-war scene of the late 1960s. So Morrison was thought to represent the angst of the teenage generation of young people at that time who were against the Vietnam War, and they were aligning themselves with all these political movements that were taking place at the time, all these anti-establishment rallies and such. So that's Jim Morrison, the rock god. But the top picture that we have here on the left is of a very collegiate, clean-cut looking James Douglas Morrison on the bow of the ship that his naval commander father was in charge of. So Jim's looking rather different there to his rock god image that he came out with a few years later. And round about this time, by the way, 1964, Jim Morrison made a commercial for a university in Florida, encouraging students to attend university. And he's there in his college blazer. So he's filming a commercial. In other words, he's acting. He was an actor. And it turns out his role in The Doors was that of an actor as well, because his father here, the naval commander, George Stephen Morrison, just happened to be in charge of the fleet of ships that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which springboarded America into the long, protracted, bloody Vietnam War. So somehow we have to reconcile the rock icon son with the warmongering naval commander father and explain how it can be that both emerge from the same family. And people might make the argument that it's just one of those isolated things, and they point to the fact that in interviews in later years, Jim Morrison used to claim that his parents were dead, and he disowned them. But this is not an isolated incident. It's very far from it. As Dave McGowan showed, with pretty much every prominent artist you could select, you find these worrying connections going back into not just the military intelligence, but important bloodline families going back a long way in history. So David Crosby, one-time member of the Byrds, better known for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, turns out that he is more than just the son of Major Floyd Delafield Crosby, military connection. David Van Cortlandt Crosby, as it turns out, comes from the Van Cortlandt, Van Schuyler and Van Rensselaer families, very important bloodlines coming out of the Netherlands, who migrated to the US. And the Crosby family tree includes a truly dizzying array of US senators and congressmen, state senators and assemblymen, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court justices, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and members of the Continental Congress. Would you expect to find all of that in the family background of a long-haired, hippie, stoner rock artist? Probably not. And McGowan, pictured here, went on to detail many other artists who fit this bill, including the father of the Mamas and the Papas star, John Phillips, who was also a career Marine Corps officer, and his mother, sister and first wife were all career employees of the Defense Department at the Pentagon. What were the chances? Furthermore, John Phillips's first wife, Susie Adams, was a direct descendant of John Adams, America's second president. Even Phillips himself went to West Point and was being prepped for a military career before, for some reason, he got steered off into the world of the counterculture, LSD-laden psychedelic rock scene. In many cases, you have the artists themselves telling you where it is they came from so that no doubt can be left. And this was the case with a band that was contemporary with that psychedelic scene at the end of the 1960s. It was a rock band called Coven. And they made no bones about their affiliation to dark occult ritualism and their adherence to mystery school teachings. This is the front woman, Esther Jinx Dawson. And as I say, the imagery speaks 1,000 pictures on its own. In an interview, she made it very clear where she came from before she ended up in this rock group. She said, "I am of the Mayflower Society, a direct descendant of John Howland, 13th signatory to the Mayflower Compact. Members of my family were also active in Freemasonry. My father was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and my grandfather, a former lieutenant governor of Indiana, was high priest of the Royal Archmasons. My great-grandfather was in the private circle of US President Teddy Roosevelt, and we are listed in the book The First Families of America. So I'm steeped in American Illuminati, right there from the horse's mouth. So we begin to see now that none of these musicians that we think of as having worked their way up the ladder from rags to riches, crossed their fingers for good luck, played a few gigs, written a few songs, and just hoped it all goes well. None of them just happened to get a big break against all the odds. The only reason these people are placed in prominent positions where they can have an influential effect on large numbers of people through their output is down to the family bloodlines that they emanate from, or the affiliations and connections that they have, and therefore the agendas that they're able to push through these popular culture vehicles to affect people's psyches and change their thoughts and perceptions on things. Another example of one who was told what he was going to be very early on is Jazz Coleman, giving us the Freemasonic shush sign here, denoting the keeping of secrets and the non-breaking of Masonic oaths to the Brotherhood, and dressed up to look very death-like and satanic here. He's from the group Killing Joke. Killing Joke are often hailed as one of these bands that is telling you what's going on. They're down with certain knowledge, and through certain songs they've put out and the lyrics in them, people claim that they're warning us about the New World Order agenda. They're on our side. They're a band of the people. But are they really? We can look into Jazz Coleman's background. In an interview, he stated, "My great-great-great-grandfather was Mangal Pandey, who led the insurrection against the British in 1857 and is revered in Mother India as one of the great nationalists. Then there's B.N. Pandey, who wrote The Breakup of British India and was very close to Gandhi. My grandfather was in the 1962 war with China." So more military connections, more connections into the British Empire and ancestry and important historical figures. And just another example of the frontman of a rock group who only got there as a result of who his family is. And Jazz Coleman has said at a very young age, he was told, you're going to be a prominent musician, a prominent rock star. It puts me very much in mind of what a nanny of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson came out recently and said. She worked with the family many decades ago when Boris Johnson was a young lad, and she recalls his family telling him that one day you will be British Prime Minister. And lo and behold, decades into the future, he was. These roles are never left to chance. They're pre-planned, and in many cases, they're planned decades in advance. Roles such as these are so influential that they would never let just anyone take them on. They would only ever want one of their own, coming from one of these secret societies or one of these important bloodline families, and this is where we get into the world of lifetime actors, so-called. This is a phrase that was coined by the American researcher and author Joseph Atwill, and it refers to the dynamic where you've got someone in the public eye, you've got someone who is famous, they're a celebrity, they're known for one thing or the other. It could be a politician, it could be a Hollywood actor, or it could be a musician such as Dave Grohl here, giving us some very telling symbology in terms of what he represents. So Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters, and he was earlier in Nirvana, serves as a great example. He was earlier in a punk band out of DC. His father, James Harper Grohl, worked in politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. Robert's father was William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, and his father was Alfonso Taft, a founder of the Skull and Bones Occult Secret Society operating out of Yale University. During John Kerry's presidential campaign in 2004, Dave Grohl joined the trail and dedicated the album In Your Honor to the former Skull and Bones man. Yeah, rock and roll. Still think that Dave Grohl's this cool rock guy that just, came out of nowhere and played a couple of bands and just got famous the way you do? Or is it down to where he came from and the agendas that he helps push? He's just made the record with Mick Jagger called Easy Sleazy, where they're basically mocking and taking the piss out of so-called conspiracy theorists. They've got lyrics like Bill Gates is shooting through my veins, and they're mocking the whole vaccine agenda, and they're just making light of the lockdowns and the stay-at-home orders and all this. So you got Sir Mick Jagger. He studied at the London School of Economics, which is one of these major social engineering think tanks where they devise all these agendas of how they're going to control society and manipulate people through their psyches. And Dave Grohl's making a record with him, propping him up, because they're all pals together. They're all out of the same fraternities. They're all out of the same secret society networks and groups. Here's a credit card bill that came in. It was shared on the internet by Dave Grohl. The bill in this restaurant came to $333. Dave thought it'd be a nice touch to leave a $333 tip and round it up to 66630. Go figure. One of the beloved numbers of these dark occult groups and networks which control everything. Because the same groups and networks which control the music industry and decide who all the major influential players are going to be are the same groups and networks that control the Hollywood film industry, the television industry, the world of big business, the world of medicine, the world of big pharma, the world of the military, the world of the mass media, the world of politics, the world of organised religion, and every other aspect of our experienced daily lives. It's the same cabal. It's the same groups at the end of the day, and the connections just go on forever. How else could it be explained how a rock singer, which is what he's supposed to be, right? I mean, Bono's just the singer with U2. So how does a rock singer get to hang out with the likes of George Bush, Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Barack Obama, the Pope? Not that you'd want to, mind. This is not exactly my idea of a great party and people I'd like to hang out with. Where's a roof collapse when you need one? But here's Bono hobnobbing with all these globalists, so-called, all these key players. So how did he become best mates with Bill Gates and Bill Clinton and all these people? Well, it's because Bono is a lifetime actor. It's not so much that he's a rock singer, it's down to the family that he came out of and the real work for which he was always being earmarked. And he's doing that real work now, hanging out with Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, helping to push the United Nations Agenda 2030, helping to do his bit with the Great Reset, helping to do his bit pushing smart cities and 5G transhumanism and futurism and all this, pushing all these new economic agendas through. That's why he's hanging out with all this lot. But he had to become famous first. You had to know who he was. So he was given a role with U2, so everyone got used to him being a rock singer. And then, at a certain stage, he started stepping aside, spending less time in the stadiums and the concert halls, and more time hanging out with the likes of this lot. This is a prominent Irish barrister by the name of Barbara Hewson. She died in January of this year, but she was very controversial prior to that, down to her... excuse me. Got a bit of a sore throat at the moment. Apologies for that. Down to her campaigning for the age of consent for adults to be able to have sex with children to be lowered to 13. She was also a prominent pro-abortionist. So, an article in this magazine asked the question, who is Ireland's Barbara Hewson? age of consent to 13, murder, and Bono, 1498 till now. Well, if we do some genealogical delving, we find the Hewson family, originally known as Hewitson, coming out of Yorkshire, England in the 15th century, and there was a key member of that family who decided to move the Hewsons from England to Ireland, and so future generations of the family started growing up in Ireland, and you could probably guess where this is going. The real name of Bono is Paul David Hewson. He's related to the aforementioned Barbara Hewson, and they all emanate from this important English bloodline which was exported to Ireland. So it's the dynamic of lifetime actors in effect. You've got one spin-off of that family, Barbara Hewson the barrister, who's put to work in the legal profession where she has major influence, such as in trying to lower the age of consent. And then you've got Bono doing all the stuff that he's doing with Bill Gates and the United Nations and all the rest of it as his real work. Lifetime actors, the lot. They know, they might as well say. And this brings us on to Bono's best mate, Bob Geldof, who has managed to become a knight of the British Empire, despite the fact that he's not actually English. But he's not fully Irish either. There's Jewish genealogy when you get into his bloodline. And it was the same thing with Bob Geldof. His real work was the Band-Aid Project, the Live Aid Project, and all these globalist agendas that he's been used to prop up, very similar to Bono, in the wake of it all. But you had to get used to who Bob Geldof was. You had to know him as a public figure before he could be put to use in these things. And so he was positioned as the lead singer with the Irish punk new wave group, the Boomtown Rats, just so that you get to know who he is. And then a little bit down the line, he starts doing his real work. This is the way it always is with lifetime actors. At a certain point in their career, they stop doing so much of the singing and the playing shows and the making records, and they start getting involved in extracurricular activities, which let you know what they're really all about and who they really serve. So we get in now to an absolutely mind-blowing bloodline that just spins off in all kinds of ridiculous directions. And it's linked to the Bush family. And this was even reported in the UK's Daily Mail. So it must be true, right? But seriously, this was based around research by professional genealogists who had traced back family trees several generations and in all kinds of different directions. And they found that with the Bush family, George W. Bush in the centre there, this particular family tree spins off in some amazing directions and usually through cousins. You often find it's 12th, 13th cousins 5 times removed, so they can be quite distant relatives. But one way or another, they are related, and blood and ancestry and genes is what links them all. So it's another piece of evidence to reinforce the idea that important bloodline families have been running the show in this reality for a very long time. And if you're not part of one of them, you don't get to join their very special club. So George Bush in the centre, and one way or another, he's related to Barack Obama, 11th cousins. Then you can trace it to Brad Pitt, who is 9th cousins with Barack Obama. George Bush was related to his own vice president, Dick Cheney. And if you go back far enough, 7th cousins 5 times removed, you get a link from George Bush going all the way back to Abraham Lincoln, who in turn is connected to Tom Hanks. Then you also have a connection between George Bush and his running opponent in the 2004 election, John Kerry. They both attended Skull and Bones at Yale University, that secret society, and they're related. It goes all the way back to Vlad the Impaler of ancient Transylvania, and Prince Charles of the so-called British royal family has been very proudly crowing about how he's descended from Vlad the Impaler on the side of the Queen Mother. He's very proud of that. We've got a connection into Princess Diana coming out of George Bush, 11th cousin twice removed. I mean, what are the chances of this happening by pure happenstance, rather than all of this being pre-planned and all these people being ushered into these prominent positions. And yet when newspapers report on this, they do act as if it's an amazing coincidence. Who would have thought this? Isn't it astounding what these genealogists have uncovered? Well, it's not astounding when you know how the game is played. It becomes very, very predictable. So then on the bottom right, we have Madonna, and it's been very widely reported that she's a cousin of Celine Dion on her French-Canadian mother's side. Madonna also cousins with Ellen DeGeneres. They both share those French-Canadian roots. And it turns out that Madonna is also cousins with Lady Gaga. And we're given these rags to riches story with both of these artists, which in all seriousness we're asked to believe in terms of how they came onto the scene. So Lady Gaga, we're told, struggled for years in poverty, and she wanted to become a star, wanted to become famous, worked really hard at it, suffered many knockbacks, and eventually, against all the odds, after trying really hard, she finally broke through. And it's very similar to what Madonna had to say in this monologue at the start of her 1985 video for the Virgin Tour. She says herself, "I went to New York, I had a dream, I wanted to be a big star, I didn't know anybody, I wanted to dance, I wanted to sing, I wanted to do all those things. I wanted to make people happy, I wanted to be famous, I wanted everybody to love me, I wanted to be a star. I worked really hard and my dream came true." Yeah, because that's all you need to do, kids. You just gotta turn up in New York with not a dime to your name, don't know anyone in town, and just really want that dream. Just never stop wanting it. Work really hard, work your charisma, work your magic, and you too could be like Madonna. You too could influence the world as much as she has. And you too could have a career that lasts decades. Yeah, because that's how it works. More connections going into the world of military intelligence. A great example of how this all works comes from the group The Police. And you might recognise in the centre there Stuart Copeland, the drummer with the new wave group The Police. These are the three Copeland brothers. You've got Ian, you've got Stuart in the middle, and you've got Miles Copeland Jr., or Miles Axe Copeland as he's known on the right hand side. And these were all the sons of a career CIA agent who was legendary within intelligence circles and had postings all over the world, did loads of top secret work by the name of Miles Copeland Jr. The father and the son had the same name. So both of Miles Copeland Jr.'s or all three of his sons, I should say, were put to use in the music industry. And between them, they had various organisations that they set up. One of them was Frontier Booking International, which they used to manage and book shows for many of the prominent bands coming out of that punk and new wave scene in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So that's Frontier Booking International, or FBI for short. Then you also had International Records Syndicate, which was a label concern of these brothers. And so that, of course, was IRS. And they also formed Copeland International Artists, standing for CIA. So do you ever get the impression that they're placing the truth right there in plain sight, and that they might just be mocking you to your face by making it so bloody obvious? And of course, the group that the family formed was titled The Police, as in perhaps policing the rest of the genre, acting as gatekeepers, keeping an eye on what goes on, keeping control over what other bands were successful, which ones made it, which ones didn't. The Police with Sting, as in a sting operation, Just a thought. This is the Chelsea Hotel in New York City. This figured prominently in research that I did for Musical Truth Volume 2. It's got some very unsavoury links to the music industry, but also to other aspects of culture, such as movies, TV shows, and plays. A great many music makers, songwriters, playwrights, and authors hold themselves up in the Chelsea Hotel at one point or another in their career. So, for instance, Arthur C. Clarke wrote 2001 A Space Odyssey there. The beat poets Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso were residents. Jack Kerouac wrote his novel On the Road in its rooms. Arthur Miller wrote The Chelsea Effect to document his time there in the 1960s. The writer Dylan Thomas was staying there when he's said to have died of pneumonia on the 9th of November 9/11, 1953. Charles Jackson, author of The Lost Weekend, committed suicide in his room there on the 21st of September, the autumn equinox, 1968. Others to have called the Chelsea home at some point or another include the occultist Harry Everett Smith, who died in its room 328, Stanley Kubrick, Ethan Hawke, Dennis Hopper, Eddie Izzard, Uma Thurman, Elliot Gould, Jane Fonda, and Russell Brand, among many others. Punk's D.D. Ramone wrote a book, apparently fictionalised, where he talks of groups in robes holding occult rituals in the hotel's basement. So all of this tends to suggest that the Chelsea Hotel housed some kind of mind control facility, and that many of these famous people that spent some time residing there may well have been undergoing mind control treatment. Elvis Costello had a song titled I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, and there's a lyric in there where it talks of men in white coats shaking you gently by the throat. And I think many people assumed that Elvis Costello, being based in Britain, was talking about Chelsea in London when he wrote that song, but I suspect he was talking about the Chelsea Hotel in New York and saying I don't want to go there. And for good reason, I would suggest. Many suicides, many people are said to have jumped from windows in the Chelsea to their death. More here, connecting Madonna. Many music videos have been filmed at the Chelsea. There's connections also going into Tom Waits, The Grateful Dead, Patti Smith, Iggy Pop, Jeff Beck, Phil Lynott, Cher, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Alice Cooper, Janis Joplin, Bette Midler, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, Canned Heat, and Leonard Cohen. Some more names that spent time at the Chelsea Hotel. What was the attraction of the place? And an even more intriguing link, several survivors of the Titanic are said to have stayed for some time after the 1912 disaster, as the hotel is close to the Pier 54 dock where the liner was supposed to have arrived. So certain locations become very interesting in this research, as well as the personnel, as well as families and such. Another key place in New York, this is before we even get to the Dakota building, outside which John Lennon was said to have been assassinated, and that was the setting for the very dark Roman Polanski movie Rosemary's Baby. We also have the Essex House Hotel, which is actually very close to the Dakota, adjacent to it in New York Central Park. And it was from here that the soul singer Donny Hathaway, pictured here, fell to his death in 1979, very shortly after completing a recording session. He's said to have got back to his room at the Essex House and decided to throw himself out of the window to his death. Lots about this story doesn't add up. Donny Hathaway had no reason to want to kill himself, according to the people that had been present in the recording session that he'd just come out of. Also, the glass in the window of the room from which he jumped is said to have been precision removed using professional glass cutting equipment. How many soul singers walk around with that kind of kit in their bag, I wonder. So it seems that Donny Hathaway was murdered for whatever reason, and there's lots to suggest that the Essex House is another hotbed of mind control programming. It's also a known CIA safe house as part of the MKUltra mind control programming, which is very intrinsically linked to the entertainment business, the music game, the Hollywood film game. MKUltra Monarch style programming is absolutely everywhere. More on that shortly. We're getting into the realms of predictive programming now, and how popular culture vehicles have long been used to plant depictions of real world events which are known to be coming years and decades in advance, using symbolism, occult symbolism. So certain ideas and themes and icons and motifs are placed into the collective subconscious mind of the general public, so that they have no idea that it's there. It's not recognized by the conscious mind, it just gets absorbed by the subliminal mind, where the imagery gets acted upon and gets processed without any conscious knowledge of it on the part of the recipient. This is construction of the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan, taking place in the 1960s. Construction was completed of World Trade Center 1, Tower 1, in 1968. 33 years later, a Masonic 33, that tower came down in the events of 9/11 2001. In this article of Newsweek magazine from April the 3rd, 1967, we've got David Rockefeller, that nice man, representing the Rockefeller family bloodline, one of the key bloodlines in this whole scenario. So there he is, sat at the window of his office, looking out over the Manhattan skyline, and he's wearing a watch. And it's been noticed that if you close in on the watch, you'll notice that the time is set to 9:11. The 9 and the 11 are highlighted on the watch. In that same issue, you've got the ad, which is pictured here on the right, and the guy has a sweatshirt with a design that looks very similar to what would become the two World Trade Center towers. And this would appear to be some very sly and very clever predictive programming type planning, all the way back in 1967, giving advanced knowledge of what was to come. We have some examples from the music world of aspects of 9/11 that were encoded into things that would have been seen and absorbed into the subconscious mind of many people through this famous Supertramp album, For Breakfast in America, which came out in 1978. This is what the sleeve design looks like in its original form. You got the name of the group Supertramp across the top of the Manhattan skyline there. You've got a scene from an aeroplane window coming in over Manhattan, and you've got the waitress there serving orange juice. Orange is a colour associated with Freemasonry and with the number 33. So it's been noticed that if you do a mirror image reversal, a satanic inversion of that sleeve, an interesting effect takes place. Now, above the World Trade Center towers that were brought down on that day in 2011, you have what appear to be a 9 and an 11 over the top of the towers. Bearing in mind again, this is a scene from an aeroplane window at breakfast time. Many other examples of what happened on September 11th, 2001 that appear to have been encoded into record sleeves and all other works of popular culture as well. There have been identified from movies and TV shows and cartoons, hundreds of examples of different aspects of that day that would have been fed into the subconscious of many, many people leading up to that fateful day. Here's another example from the music world, from a little known hip hop act called The Coup. They had an album called Party Music, which they put out in June 2001. So this is just a few weeks before the towers of the World Trade Center went up in an explosion exactly of the kind that we see on this sleeve. And we can argue all day about what really brought the towers down. I'm well aware of all the different suggestions, directed energy weapons, nanothermite, no planes, all the rest of it. It doesn't matter what method was used. The point is, this is what the American public witnessed. This is what the American public was asked to absorb into their psyche, and this was the official version of things that people were being prepared for. So on this cover, you got the frontman of the group there, Boots Riley, who appears to be detonating this explosion with a car stereo as a kind of remote detonator. So does this indicate foreknowledge on the part of this group, or whoever controls them, or whoever designed that sleeve, of what was to come in September? Or was it just a lucky guess at odds of several billion to one? Well, after the events of 9/11 happened in September, this album sleeve, unsurprisingly, was very quickly withdrawn from circulation, and it was replaced with a new design. And the group never really gave any adequate explanation as to how they'd been able to predict what was going to happen. Well, the answer, of course, is that the forces that control the music industry and the Hollywood film industry and all the rest of them ultimately are the same forces, or are affiliated with the same forces that caused the events of 9/11. And they feed this predictive programming symbol to the minds of the general public, so that when the event happens, or when it's presented through the mainstream media as having happened in a particular way, there's already a subliminal familiarity with the narrative in the minds of the public. They've already absorbed aspects of it. Some people also feel that these occultists, because that's what they are, dark occult practitioners, magicians, are helping to bring about what they wish to achieve by presenting aspects of it in popular culture vehicles. Because people pay their mass attention to it. Energy goes where attention flows. So the feeling is that they're actually helping to empower into physical manifestation that which they hope to achieve by giving us depictions of it beforehand. And the other reason why it gets done is down to the Satanists, the occultists' favoured tenet of placing the truth in plain sight. They feel in their dark, sick, twisted mentality that they can escape somehow the forces of karma, of consequentialism, and avoid the debt that would ordinarily come bearing down on them by doing great harm to others, by gaining our tacit approval for it as they see it. So if they announce in their cryptic, coded, subliminal ways what they intend to do, and they in turn receive no objection from us, how could they? Because how could anyone realistically be expected to understand what's being communicated here? And how are you supposed to express your lack of consent even if you think you have spotted it? Nevertheless, they seem to feel that this is something they have to do to avoid their karmic consequence. And I've always said I feel they've got some very harsh shocks coming when Judgment Day arrives for them. When they hear, who's there? Karma. Oh shit. It's not going to be a happy day for them. The Vigilant Citizen. This website has been a source of great information for me, great research, thevigilanttcitizen.com. The tagline goes, "Symbols rule the world, not words or laws." Ain't that the truth? Subliminal programming through symbols and motifs and icons. And we're getting in now to that very ugly world of satanic ritual abuse and trauma-based mind control programming, done primarily to children at a young age. This is the Mickey Mouse Club coming out of the Disney Corporation, a deeply satanic, deeply dark corporation, it turns out. And it churns out on its conveyor belt many future celebrities. So in this particular Mickey Mouse Club intake, you had Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera and Justin Timberlake, all of whom were positioned to become influential pop stars and actors as the years wore on. You got Britney Spears here sporting the Mickey Mouse ears, which are actually symbolic of mind control programming having taken place. Britney Spears stands as a great example of a celebrity that would have undergone this style of programming from a very young childhood. And the occultists are letting each other know here, by the wearing of these ears, that she's been subjected to this. The origin of the Mickey Mouse ears is said to have come from the film reels that used to be loaded onto projectors in the early days of filmmaking. Because when these mind control victims are subjected to horrific trauma, and it causes their minds to dissociate from reality, they're said to enter these illusory worlds, which are like going into a movie scene. And certain early movies have long been identified as mind control triggers that are used to set off the programming in many of these poor victims. The Wizard of Oz is one that you constantly hear about. The Wizard of Oz is a mind control programming trigger, as are the Alice stories from Lewis Carroll, Freemason and paedophile. Alice Through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland, those stories are steeped with symbolism that pertains to trauma-based mind control. So there's been this court battle recently concerning the conservatorship of Britney Spears, and it's arguing as to who should get to handle her personal affairs, whether it's the family or whether it's the corporation or whether it's other parties that have acted as her managers or handlers in the past. And this is a very strange thing, because Britney Spears is a grown adult. Should she not be able to handle her own personal and business affairs for herself? Well, if she can't, maybe it's because she's been mind controlled to oblivion, and she's got so many different alters going on within her personality that she can no longer be considered one person, one individual. These altars are created through the trauma, through the satanic ritual abuse, in many cases as a result of the families that these people come out of, these celebrities. Remember earlier on, we were looking at the bloodline of Madonna on the part of her French-Canadian mother, and all the different bloodlines that connects back into. Here's Madonna with the same Mickey Mouse ears for the song Dear Jessie. And the video to this was full of cartoons and childlike baby stuff. And this is all references to the trauma-based mind control that takes place at these very young formative ages. They start this horrific programming to shatter the mind and create these different personalities, these different alters at a very young age, very young childhood. It's very sick. It's very evil. The Disney Corporation is at the centre of so much of it. It's been identified that the word Mickey, as it's presented here, if you do a mirror image reversal of it, it actually comes out as the word wicked. So they're telling you to the subliminal mind, which works with inverted imageries. This makes sense to the subliminal mind, which absorbs everything, but it doesn't make any sense to the conscious mind, which filters out that which it consciously acknowledges. So if you ever stopped the average person and said, did you realise that Mickey encodes wicked, they would deny it to your face, and yet here's the evidence. This is Nicki Minaj, who is another prime candidate for having undergone mind control programming. One derivative of MKUltra that came out of the CIA was known as monarch programming, and it refers to the monarch butterfly, which goes through a metamorphosis as it changes from a caterpillar into a butterfly. And this is supposed to symbolise, as far as the mind control handlers are concerned, the metamorphosis that goes on inside the heads of those that have been subjected to this trauma. It causes them to undergo different personalities. The mind shatters into different alters, and it tries to deal with the horrific trauma by tucking it away into these different alters. And a skilled mind control programmer, who have often been victims of it themselves before they become handlers, can bring forth these different alters at will with trigger words and phrases. Nicki Minaj stood as a great example of this a few years ago when she first emerged. She used to have this alter ego known as Roman Zolanski, which is obviously a reference to the convicted paedophile filmmaker Roman Polanski. But she used to slip into this persona during interviews and during stage performances, and her voice would change, she'd take on a completely different air, and she would say, "Oh no, Roman's here, I've become Roman." It's classic indication that she slipped from her front altar personality into one of these programmed ones. And a few years ago at, I think it was the VMA, or it might have been the Grammy Awards, it was a deeply dark and deeply satanic show, even by that event's standards. She announced that she was publicly exorcising Roman Zolanski from herself, and she's not used that particular altar from that day to this. One of the other motifs that's used to identify the presence of mind control programming is pink hair, incidentally, and many of the female victims of this programming are portrayed as dolls, and more specifically Barbie dolls. Nicki Minaj's nickname for some time was Barbie doll or Barbs. So they're telling you right to your face what she is. She had out a record called Out of My Head a few years ago, where she's in a straitjacket in a mental institution with all these demented scrawlings on the wall, and she's there with her pink hair. They're not backward in coming forward. Thinking about the monarch butterfly as symbolising the presence of mind control, we get it with Mariah Carey. She, like Britney Spears and like Nicki Minaj, often slips into a British girl accent in interviews. It's another example of her going into an altar. And she does a very similar voice to that which Britney Spears does when they start speaking with a British sort of English society posh accent. And the fact that all three of these have the English girl accent makes me think that they've all been subject to the same methods of mind control programming, and they've had the same altars established within them. You often hear of celebrities going a bit crazy and going off the rails when they've been subject to mind control. Most of us probably remember Britney Spears' famous incident of several years ago where she went into a hair salon and grabbed the clippers and shaved off all her hair. And she was talking about she's got to get these implants, she's got to get these things out of her head, as if things have been plugged into her. And then she started attacking cars with umbrellas, and everyone in the media was saying, what's gone on with Britney? She's gone a bit crazy, she's gone a bit mad. What is it with these celebrities? Well, people might well wonder why they all behave in such haphazard ways, such bizarre behaviours. These are indicative of the mind control programming starting to break down, and of the celebrity in question having to go back to the lab to have their programming topped up again. That's what we saw with Britney. Several years ago, there was an incident with Mariah Carey where she was up on stage, supposedly rambling incoherently on the mic, and her handler had to come on stage, take the microphone from her, lead her away. Mariah Carey is not seen in public for a few weeks. When she comes back, she's got a brand new image, brand new album on the way, and she's ready to go again. She's been reprogrammed. And there was this incident also round about the same time where she was said to have suffered a breakdown. This is how it's explained in the mainstream press. She suffered a bit of a nervous breakdown and she attempted suicide. All classic signs of the programming starting to wear off. It goes back a long way as well. I think mind control programming has been present since the very early days of the industry. This is S.E.E.D Barrett, the frontman of Pink Floyd. The official story with S.E.E.D Barrett is that during Pink Floyd's 1960s psychedelic era, where they were put out there as the poster children of that whole London counterculture scene, they were the house band at the UFO Club, a very important venue in getting this psychedelic avant-garde counterculture flower power scene established in London. S.E.E.D Barrett was the frontman. Pink Floyd's music back then was very different to what they're mainly known for, from Dark Side of the Moon onwards, when Syd Barrett had to be replaced in the group by David Gilmour. And the official version for why he had to be replaced is because Syd fried his brains on too much acid. He did too much LSD, he became unpredictable and haphazard and just could no longer function, could no longer perform, could no longer write songs, just went a bit crazy. I feel there's more to it than that. I feel that Syd Barrett was a mind control subject. They were experimenting on him. They were trying to keep him on track with the agenda by messing with his mind, and something went wrong. The mind control didn't work the way it was supposed to, and Syd became surplus to requirements, shall we say. So he was shuffled off into the background, and very little was heard about him all the way through to his death in 2000 at the age of 60. In this particular album, a collection of his songs, we have so many familiar motifs pertaining to mind control. When you see the mirror frame like this, when you see that creepy mask, when you see teddy bears and dolls and other things that pertain to the innocence of early childhood, you're getting some very sick, very subliminal indicators of the presence of trauma-based mind control programming, probably going back to early childhood. Vigilant Citizen, through its many articles, will train you in what to look for. So when you see this stuff in pop videos and in live music stage shows and on record sleeves, you never miss a trick again. There's black and white checkerboard flooring everywhere. There's dolls. There's bears with missing limbs. There's mind control patterns and spirals such as this everywhere. There's broken mirrors. And when you come to know what it means, you really do see it everywhere. This is a recent video for the song Who Cares from the album Egypt Station from long-time industry asset and faithful server, Freemason, Sir Paul McCartney. Still out there doing it. Whichever one he may be, whether it's the original, whether it's a different Paul, whether there ever were more than one Paul, like I say, that's a talk for another day. But what you've got going on here is classic mind control symbolism. The spiral, particularly that spinning spiral, is identified as a trigger for trauma-based mind control programming. Note the design of the brooch that he's got on there. You've got the duality between the black and the white. This is what you get elsewhere in the video. This girl is portraying the role of a mind control subject. Paul McCartney is portraying the role of a doctor, a handler. He knows what he's doing. At his age, at his time of life, having already served the system for decade after decade after decade, he's still doing it. Because when you join this club and when you become one of their key players, you do it for the rest of your days. That's why Mick Jagger is still putting out agenda-pushing records. That's why Tom Jones is still out there doing it. That's why Cliff Richard is still touring. All sirs, by the way. Sir Tom, Sir Cliff, Sir Mick, Sir Elton John, putting out an ad the other week coercing people to take the vaccine, alongside Sir Michael Caine. And we've really seen this over this COVID scamdemic agenda, haven't we? All these owned assets, all these tools and stooges of these different industries called to prop up the agenda. They're all there making their public service commercials saying, please take the vaccine, it's the only way we can all get back to normal, and make sure you wear your mask. Sir Ringo Starr put out a video on New Year's Eve with his mask on, playing his drum kit, reminding us how important it is to stay at home and protect others and put your mask on and all of this. These people are pathetic. They're pathetic at the end of the day. They have no mind of their own. They have no voice of their own. They're all doing what they're told. Yes, they've got the fame and fortune. Yes, they've got the celebrity, if that's something that's important to you, if that's something that has any value to you. But they don't have their own lives. They don't have their own minds. They don't have the freedom that the likes of you and I do to express ourselves the way we see to, individually, holistically, spontaneously, authentically. Owned assets till the day they exit this reality. Can it ever really be worth it? I would say not. In summary then, they, the occultists that control these industries, lie to our faces, but they tell the truth cryptically for those who are able to decipher the obfuscation. So the nightly news and the proclamations of politicians will be pure deception, and usually a 180-degree inversion of the truth, whether it's in what we're trained to think of as fiction or entertainment, that the truth so often lies, albeit concealed with layers of symbolism and allegory. So this reminds us of the satanic inversion that we have in society. How everything we've ever been taught is a lie, and how the truth can usually be found in the direct opposite direction in this world of duality. So people think that the BBC Evening News, or CNN or Fox or whatever, is telling them the truth of what's really going on in the world. But what's really happening when people watch these broadcasts? They're being lied to their faces. They're being manipulated. They're having propaganda and mind control dumped on them, dressed up as truth. Then, when people go to the cinema for some escapism, as it's called, fantasy, imagination, a world of illusion, as we're told, or people turn on a TV show, or they go to see a favourite band play, or they switch on a music video, listen to a favourite CD, what they think they're getting is harmless entertainment. Bit of fun. Letting their hair down after a hard day at work and just relaxing. That's the key to it. You see, the mind is at its most relaxed, it's most off guard when it thinks it's just being entertained. It's not expecting to be mind controlled, and is certainly not expecting to have the truth of what's really going on in the world communicated through things like songs, videos, TV shows, movies. But that's where they tell us the truth. That's where they announce what they plan to do. We've just got to get vigilant enough and disciplined enough to start paying more attention to what it is that gets done to us and the methods that get used. When you learn about how lifetime actors and culture creation work, the question becomes, are you happy that you were duped and taken into confidence by these people? And would you like more of it? Or are you rather hacked off that you were treated as such easy fodder, rife for manipulation? And now that you understand how the game is played, do you resolve to never be fooled in the same way again? As The Who stated on their song, "We won't get fooled again." There's no shame in admitting that you were bamboozled. All of us are, from the earliest age. The dignity comes from acknowledging that it happened and knowing better for next time. As Led Zeppelin stated on their famous song Stairway to Heaven, which could be analysed for days in its own right, yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. And I think that's a pretty good note on which to leave things. Much of what I've discussed in the presentation today can be found in my two Musical Truth books. Volume 1 published in 2016, and I've just produced an audio version of this, where I've narrated the content. It comes out at 17 and a half hours worth of audio. Not a one-time listen, I would suggest. There's also Volume 2, which was released in 2018. I've yet to voice the audio version of that. And if anyone's interested in getting copies of either of those, they are available on Amazon. But if anyone wants to bypass Amazon and get copies from me myself, you're very welcome to drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com and we can arrange purchases. My other main website is djmarkdevlin.com, by the way, which serves as a one-stop shop hub for all my activities. You can connect through to all my YouTube videos and all my podcasts and interviews from that site. That's djmarkdevlin.com. My most recent book was The Cause and the Cure, which was a piece of allegorical fiction. I wanted to try my hand at a novel, and with this one I've loaded it up with symbolism and allegory and metaphor. It works on many different levels, and I feel someone that wants to try and decode a lot of that stuff could have a lot of fun in doing so. So that's available from the same sources as the others. Other than that, I just want to thank everyone for listening to this presentation. Once again, thanks to Brandon and everyone else involved in organising S.E.E.D. Who knows, maybe next year we'll be able to have one of these in person. Maybe all the BS will have gone away. Maybe we'll be able to travel freely again. Maybe we'll have put all this tyranny and this dystopia and these outrageous affronts to our rights and freedoms down where they belong. Who knows? But either way, I'll catch you all again in some form sometime soon. Thanks again for listening.